Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the Champions Chess Tour and the Chessable Masters. Now, in Division 1, Magnus Carlsen has been doing very, very well. Today, we have the grand final of the winner's bracket between Magnus and Denis Lazovic from Belarus. Now, Denis Lazovic is a player who's done very well in the Champions Chess Tour over the last year and a half. And in this year's edition, it's no surprise that he's defeated both Hikaru Nakamura, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, Anish Giri, and I think Jose Martinez Alcantara as well. So he's been vastly overperforming his classical rating, but he has shown his mettle in the Champions Chess Tour. So without further ado, let's jump right into the action. So we're going to start with game number 1. It is a best of 4 match. Magnus playing with the white pieces. So the game starts with c4. Now we get knight to f6, knight to c3, and we have the move e5 from Lazovic. Now it's the same opening which he played against me a couple of days ago, so this isn't really that surprising. This time Magnus plays d3. In my game against Lazovic, I actually played a3, and after d5 takes, knight f3, knight c6, I played the slightly dubious move pawn to e4. Now, when I played this in the Chess Champions Tour against Lazovic, I actually confused the line because some years back, I think 2018, if I remember correctly, I had a very similar situation against Magnus where we're not knight d5, sorry, where after d5 takes e4, I played the move knight f4, and after takes and d4, Magnus got a big advantage. So when I played Lazovic the other day, I confused the order when I played the system with this e4 knight f4, and I got a very bad position right away, and I eventually lost the game. So back to Magnus's game. So we get d3, now we get d5, takes, g3 played here by Magnus. He could have played knight f3 and e4, which hasn't played a lot, but he goes for g3. Now we get knight to c6, bishop to g2, bishop to e6, knight to f3, and now we get the move bishop e7. All this very standard. This is what we call the open English, because we have essentially reached a Sicilian with the colors reversed. What I mean by that is that normally after e4 c5, let's just say knight f3, d6, takes, knight f6, knight c3, g6, bishop e3, bishop g7, bishop e2, and knight c6. It's the exact same position with the pieces mirrored. Obviously, when white plays it, white has an extra tempo, of course. So back to the position here, we get this position after castles, bishop d2 played by Magnus. Now we get to move queen d7, and here Magnus plays knight g5. Now this might not be the best move in the position, but what Magnus is banking on is that after bishop takes knight and bishop takes bishop, he's going to end up with the 2 Bs here and a lot of play on this half open c file with the rook on c1. So Lazovic decides to play f6 here, a logical move to create the chain of 3 pawns in the center of the board and attacking the bishop on g5. Magnus goes bishop to d2, and now we get rook fd8. Magnus plays rook c1, and now we get this move a5. Now the computer here is screaming for knight takes and bishop to d5, trying to blunt the threats of this light square bishop from g2 towards the horse and the pawn. Lazovic instead goes a5, and now we get the move queen to a4, knight takes knight, pawn takes, and Lazovic plays bishop d5 here. But now in this position, after the move f3, white is actually potentially a little bit better, and the reason is simple. If you were to do it back here after takes, bishop d5, and f3 in this position, black can potentially grab the juicer on a2. So, all right, back to position after f3, we get knight to e7 from Lazovic, which is a move that I absolutely hate. Now, it's not a bad move necessarily, but when Lazovic plays knight e7 and allows the queen trade, we are in an endgame. And what does that mean? That means you are playing against Magnus Carlsen, the greatest endgame player of all time, obviously the greatest player, period, but nonetheless, someone who loves endgames. And on top of that, in this position, it's a closed situation. White has the 2 Bs, but white has a bunch of pawns. It's not open whatsoever, and Magnus is great at converting these advantages. So the game continues with c4 for Magnus. We get bishop to c6, and now he goes bishop h3, rook to d8, and now we get bishop c3. Now, what I think Magnus was doing with bishop c3 is quite simple. He wants to stop black from ever pushing pawns in the center. Perhaps black could play something like f5 and maybe e4 down the road here, trying to open up the center of the board for this rook on d8. When Magnus goes bishop c3, however, e4 is covered by both of these pawns here on d3 and f3, and you can't go f5 since you hang the pawn on e5. So Magnus is now making sure that black can't push pawns in the center of the board, and he will eventually try to use this open b file. So here we get the move king to f7, rook to b1, b6 played here by Lazovic, rook fc1, another nice move from Magnus. He's now stopped black from pushing any pawns in the center of the board, and he eventually wants to try and break through on the b and c files with these 2 towers on the squares. So we get h5. Magnus now goes f4, which is a very, very nice move. Not an easy move to play, by the way, but this move showcases why Magnus is such a great player. He puts the rooks on b1 and c1, and you're expecting him to immediately try to break through on the queen side, but now he shifts everything back towards the king side. Now Lazovic plays the move e4. Perhaps he should have traded on f4 here and played something like knight g6, but after this move bishop d2, what black is really worried about is that white is eventually going to play something like e3 followed by d4 and d5 or c5, and white has these 4 pawns on the same files connected together, and white will get an advantage. Now the computer of course laughs at us. It's like, what are you doing? It's completely equal, but nonetheless it feels a little bit iffy. However, when Lazovic plays e4 and we get d4 in this position, now black has some serious issues. For example, if you play this move f5, white can go d5 here. There's suddenly threats like bishop to e5 targeting both of these pawns, and also white might even be able to play something like c5 down the road, ripping open everything. And look at the 2 b's here. They're placed absolutely perfectly, as are the 2 rooks on b1 and c1. No big surprise, of course, since it's Magnus Carlsen playing with the white pieces. So after d4, now we get the move bishop to d7, bishop g2 played by Magnus. Of course, he does not want to trade off the b's. We get the move bishop to f5, and now he plays this move h3. After h3, we get rook to e8, and now Magnus plays e3. And what's happened here is that Magnus still keeps a lot of flexibility. He might push g4 down the road, but he keeps the options of both d5 and c5 both available in this position. So we get rook a d8, king f2, knight c8 is played, and now Magnus goes c5. And the reason for playing c5 here is that if he were to do it a little bit earlier, let's say here was c5, after knight to d5, black gets this great bastion, the knight is outposted here, and everything is holding together. But when Lazovic plays knight c8 and you go c5, there's no knight jumping to d5, which means now the knight is glued to c8 to protect this pawn on b6, and white can now really try to break through on these 2 files, as well as using the 2 b's. So here we get the move bishop to e6 from Lazovic. Magnus goes rook b2, guarding the pawn on a2. We get bishop d5, and now bishop to f1. After bishop f1, we get bishop e6, and now bishop to e1 played by Magnus, simply preparing to open up the c file. After bishop e1, we get rook e7. Now a3 is played, and one thing that Magnus does very well is when he gets an advantage like this, he's just sitting on the position trying to get his opponent low on time, and he's not doing anything in a hurry. So we get rook d7, bishop b5, rook e7, and now king g2 is played to guard the pawn on h3. We get king g6, and now bishop to e2. Here Lazovic plays rook h8, and Magnus decides to try and open up another diagonal with g4. Now what his idea is here is potentially he wants to go f5 and use this diagonal to put maximum pressure towards his knight, as well as these 2 pawns on the c7 and b6 squares. Again, the power of the b's from long distance, whereas a sad knight on c8 simply has no squares to move to. So after g4, we get takes, f5 played here, trying to stop Magnus from opening up another diagonal. And now Magnus trades the pawns on b6 and goes rook to c6, trying to infiltrate, creating a pin on the 6th rank as well as the kebab, and black has a lot of issues. King f7 is played here by Lazovic. As you'll notice, Lazovic down to 8 seconds. Very, very hard to play this position. Pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn. Now we get bishop c4. King e8 is played. If Lazovic were to offer the trade with the bishops, white will sack the rook, and after rook takes f5, black simply loses the rook and the game. So we get king e8, d5 played here by Magnus, trying to open up this diagonal for the dark square bishop, also intending to potentially play d6 as well. Lazovic goes bishop d7, and now we get this move rook takes b6. And this move is not the best move, but in this situation, when you look at the times, Magnus was 104 and Lazovic was 7 seconds. It's simply too difficult to defend. So we get the trade, and here Lazovic plays bishop c8. Computer says that after the very unusual looking move bishop h3 check, king g3, and rook c7, black is okay because if white ever checks, you can block with the rook, offering the trade of the rooks. Now again, very hard to find with 8 seconds, pretty much 0 chance, so Lazovic goes bishop c8 instead. Here Magnus plays rook b8, which is a mistake. b6 would have been better, but at this point Magnus is simply trying to move fast and put pressure on the clock. Lazovic goes king d7. We get bishop takes a5 here. Computer says here that rook c7 again is okay, but very hard to spot with no time. So we get bishop takes a5, Lazovic plays king d6, and now after bishop b4 check, the game is effectively over, because when Lazovic plays king c7, Magnus simply sacks another rook With rook takes c8 check. If you take with the king, I take the rook here. If you take with the rook here, there are probably a couple ways to win, but the easiest is to go d6, hitting the king and the rook. Black goes king d7, and now you throw in the very important check here. You take the rook, and with the two b's and the pass pawn marching up the board, the rest is very elementary, as Watson would say. So Magnus gets a huge win in the first game of the match, and he takes a 1-0 lead. Now the second game would be a pretty dry affair. It would end in a draw, and the next game we'll take a look at is the third game, where Magnus once again starts off with the white pieces. So the game starts with c4. We get knight f6, knight c3, e5, same opening, knight f3, knight c6, g3, d5, takes. We get bishop g2, and here Lazovic decides to play the move bishop c5 instead of transposing with bishop to e6, d3, and bishop e7 like in the first game of the match. So after bishop c5, we get castles. Now bishop c5 is these days is not considered a new idea, but it first came onto the scene in 2017 and 2018 when it was played very frequently by former world champion Vishwanathan Anand, as well as the runner-up in the 2018 World Championship match, Fabiano Caruana, who did in fact play against Magnus in that World Championship match. So you get castles, d3 played here, and now we have h6 from Lazovic, trying to stop white from a knight g5 or bishop g5 move. Magnus trades the knights, and now he goes bishop to d2, trying to bring the rook to the c file, but also potentially going for bishop c3 as well. Lazovic plays rook d8. Now we get queen c2, queen d6 played here, sidestepping any threats. Say you play a move like a6, or might be a trick like knight g5, opening all kinds of threats and forks as well. So we get queen to d6 here from Lazovic. a3 played by Magnus. We get a5, rook c1, bishop to b6, and now Magnus goes bishop to e3, trying to trade off this dark square bishop on d2 for this very powerful bishop on b6. We get bishop to e6 played. Magnus trades the b's, and now he goes queen to a4. Here Lazovic goes bishop d5, and the computer already says this is about equal, and the reason is quite straightforward. Even though black's pawn structure is potentially a little bit compromised with these double pawns, white doesn't really have play on this diagonal, and more importantly, black wants to jump to the all-powerful d4 square with the horse in a couple of moves. So Magnus goes e3 here, trying to stop knight d4. We get rook a c8, rook to c3 played, knight e7, rook c1, takes, and now Lazovic goes bishop c6. Here Magnus plays queen d1, and now we get the very enterprising move b5 being played. Now already here the computer is starting to feel like the game is trending in black's favor, or Lazovic's position should be better, and the reason is simple. Weak pawn on d3, but black also can go b4 and distract this rook on c3. Say you play h3 b4, takes. If you go here, you lose the rook to this pin, and if you go rook c1, there's probably an idea like queen d3 here or bishop b5, and it feels very scary. Now again, I'm not playing the absolute best moves. The point is this pawn on d3 is very weak, and black is trying to get rid of the one weakness he has, which is the double b pawns. So in this position after b5, we get queen e1 for Magnus, b4, takes, and now knight to d5 is played. Now knight d5 is a very interesting move from Lazovic. What he wants to do is he wants to argue that if white moves the rook after knight takes b4, you're in a lot of trouble here. If you try to save the pawn with d4, there's knight to d3, forking the queen and the rook. And if you try to guard it, I just gobble and go e4, something like this. And black simply has a great knight on d3, extra pawn on the queen side, 2-on-1, and black has great chances to win the game down the road. So after knight to d5, Magnus decides to sack the rook with rook takes c6, and computer actually thinks this is one of the better options in the position. Lazovic captures, we get b takes a5, and now we have this move c5 from Lazovic. Very interesting move to try and plant this horse on b4 permanently with the pawn guarding the knight. Now the reason I say interesting is what it does do is it opens up this long scope. So for example, say white could get the pawn to a7, there always are big threats here to try and push the pawn, whereas if black were able to play this position, let's just say white gets the pawn to a7 for example, even if you move the knight, this long diagonal is still closed. But Lazovic trusts his instinct. He trusts that putting this horse on b4, planted by the pawn on c5 and targeting d3 is worth more than worrying about one long diagonal. Now is he right? We shall see. Here Magnus decides to play the move knight d2, and this is a serious error. What Magnus should have played here was a6, and after queen takes pawn, knight b4 for example, white can go d4, and even though in this position computer gives black a little bit of an advantage here, White probably should save the game because, for example, if we get some endgame like this, just to illustrate it, something like this, if white has a bishop and 4 pawns on the king side versus a rook and 3, this will always be a theoretical draw. Instead, Magnus goes knight to d2, and now we get knight to b4. Blažević follows his intention with the pawn supporting the horse and stopping this a6 pawn thrust. Magnus now plays knight to c4, and I think this move was based on a miscalculation because after queen takes pawn, Magnus decides to play bishop f1. What I assume Magnus intended to do here when he played knight c4 and queen d3 was played is he wanted to take the juicer on e5, but after queen c2 threatening rook d1 winning the queen, bishop f3 is the only move to stop rook d1, and after f6 white is going to lose the horse. If you go to g6, it's captured. If you go to c6, for example, takes rook d1, that's game over. If you go to c4, I eat the horse. So no matter where you go here, c6 or g6 or c4, it's captured. You can't go to d7, I eat the horse. F7, same thing, I eat the horse. And if you go to g4, the only other square, now black can play a move like h5 here, and the knight is trapped on g4. You can't go back. If you take, I take. If you go here, I take. So you're going to lose the horse no matter what. So that's why Magnus has to play bishop f1. Now we get queen d5 from Blažević. Computer actually, I think, thought that there was a better move here. Maybe it was queen d1, but we get queen d5. Magnus goes queen to a1, trying to use the queen behind this passed pawn and the long diagonal to save the game. Blažević now plays knight to d3, which is a good move, not best. Queen f3 would have won, but anyway, we get knight d3. Magnus goes b3, trying to support the horse on c4, and after queen to f3, serious danger bells, or there's a danger alarm that goes off, I'm sure, in Magnus's head. And as you can tell from the eval bar, the computer thinks that white is lost. The reason is that if white were to trade the bishop for the knight, there's going to be a rook to d1 winning the queen. If you play the move queen to a2, now there's this very nasty move knight c1 as in the game. And if white plays queen c2, for example, after rook to d1, white is completely lost. If you play a move like knight d2, there's knight to e2, which is simply checkmate. King can't go anywhere. If you play a move like a6, black sacks the rook, and after king f1, queen h1, the knight on c1 covers the escape square and the king is stuck, and therefore it's game over. So that's why after knight to c1, Magnus now plays this move knight takes e5, trying to attack the queen on f3. Here Blažević plays queen e4, the absolute best move in the position, and Magnus goes queen to a4, sacrificing the horse on e5. If Magnus were to play queen b2, for example, here trying to guard the knight and attack this knight, rook to d1 with the same threat of sacking the rook and mating in the corner exists, and white is just lost. If you go a6, just to illustrate it, it's the same problem. If you play f3 here after queen e3, if you block with the queen, I take the horse and I have an extra rook on the board. If you go king to h1, I simply take the bishop, and if you go king g2, there's rook to d2 winning this queen on b2, and once again it's GG, why not? So that's why Magnus goes queen to a4, and now we get the move queen takes e5, a6 being played, queen to d5 here from Blažević, trying to cover the critical squares here in the corner. Black's knight on c1 is a little bit out of play, so Magnus is simply hoping desperately that he'll be able to create counterplay. We get a7, rook a8 played by Blažević, and now we have queen b5. You might be wondering, can't white go bishop g2, hitting the queen and the rook on the diagonal? And the reason white cannot play this move is there's knight to e2 check. If you go to f1, it's queen d1 checkmate, and if you go to h1, same thing. Queen d1 check, bishop f1, queen takes f1, game over. So Magnus plays queen b5. Now we get queen to d8, which is not the best move, but it's still good enough. Magnus plays queen b7, guarding the pawn on a7. One other point, by the way, just makes if black were to take the pawn, there's queen b8 check, simply collecting the rook on a7. So we get queen d8, queen b7, Blažević sacks the horse with knight takes pawn, and now Magnus goes bishop c4. Computer says after bishop g2, black is not completely winning here, but the reason I think Magnus didn't play this move is with time getting low, he probably saw the very obvious idea with check. Here, takes, and knight d2, and he figured after queen to a6, for example, black can go g6, followed by c4, cutting off the diagonal. If you play like queen d3, there's simply c4, queen e2, for example, and after queen c1, there's c3, c2, and black will get a second queen. But the computer says that after bishop g2 here, for example, queen d1, bishop f1, and rook a7, after takes, knight to d2, there's a very important nuance here, which you can play check, king h7, and now queen to b5, because if black goes c4, there's queen f5 check, and after king g8, queen c8, queen f5, this will be a repetition. If you try to block with a pawn, I just make the same thing, same sort of repetition for infinity. But both players low on time, so Magnus goes bishop c4, and now we get knight to d2. Magnus takes the pawn, we get king h8, king g2 played, and now Lazovic goes c4, trying to push the c-pawn down the board. Black's rook on a8 is stuck temporarily, but with this passed pawn here, Black should be able to give up this pawn and activate the rook and win the game due to the material advantage. We get bishop g6 from Magnus, c3, bishop c2 played, stopping the pawn from moving up the board. Lazovic plays queen c8, we get queen f7, and now he plays queen c6. We get e4 played, and Lazovic goes queen b6. Now Lazovic could have ended the game on the spot here with the move queen c4, offering the trade of the queens. And the reason the game is over is if white trades, you take the pawn on a7, you have an extra rook, and if white moves the queen somewhere else, there's queen to f1, which is simply checkmate. King has no squares available. Instead, we get queen b6, e5 played, queen takes pawn, queen f5, and now Lazovic plays king to g8. Magnus goes check, we get king f7, we get check, king f8, e6 played here, and now queen b7. And after king to h3, queen e7, Magnus is simply down a rook here for nothing, and he's playing on because of the time situation, but Lazovic does not let the game slip out of his grasp. It ends after queen f5, queen f6, queen d5, rook to e8, we get bishop f5, king g8 is played, e7, king to h8, queen d7, and now queen takes e7. And here Magnus Carlsen resigns in the third game of the match as he's simply down a rook for nothing. So Lazovic wins game 3 in a huge shocker to tie up the match at 1.5, and now we go to the fourth game in the match. So all square 1.5, and this is the fourth game. If it's a draw, we'll move to our Megadon. If somebody wins, they win the winners bracket in Division 1 of the Champions Chess Tour Chessable Masters. So Lazovic starts with d4. We get d5, c4. Magnus decides to play the Slav with c6 here, and now we get knight f3, knight f6, e3, bishop g4, and Magnus plays h3. Now back in 2020 or maybe 2021 during the Champions Chess Tour, I actually had a lot of games against Magnus Carlsen where I played this position from the white side and Magnus played it from the black side. So we get e6, knight c3 is played, knight bd7, we get bishop d3, Magnus plays bishop b4, and now we get castles. Here Magnus castles, and we have the move rook d1 being played. Magnus goes rook e8, and now we have queen to e2, queen to e7, and bishop d2. Now I have not actually looked at this specific position, but I suspect that this is the exact game featuring myself and Magnus from 2020 or 2021. I don't remember which online event it was, but we definitely have this position. So we get d takes c4, bishop takes c4, Magnus goes bishop d6. Now white has the two b's here, but black intends to go either c5 or e5 to challenge the white center, and the bishop on d2 at the moment is very passive with these pawns in front of it. It really does not have much scope on any diagonal. But as we saw from the first game of the match, bishops have a lot of time. If you can keep the game going, eventually diagonals will open up in the long term. So Lazovic goes e4, we get e5, d5 played here. Computer, by the way, does not like Magnus's approach. We get bishop c5, bishop to e3 played. Computer thinks that rook c1 is simply better, but the show goes on. Bishop e3, we get the trade. Queen c5 played here, and now queen e2 is played by Lazovic. We get knight b6, bishop b3, pawn takes pawn, and here Lazovic plays the move knight takes pawn. Now this move is completely acceptable. The computer actually thinks that white should play rook a c1 first, because if black were to play d4, for example, there's knight to d5, you attack the queen here, and after queen d6 and knight c7, white will fork the rooks and win some material. Instead, Lazovic decides to take the pawn here, and I think that also the other reason to point this out is that if black goes queen e7, I think after takes, now the rook is on c1, whereas in the game the rook is underdeveloped. So we get knight takes pawn, knight takes, bishop takes, queen e7 played, rook c1, and now we get rook a8. Maybe it would be a transposition, by the way, if these exact moves occurred with rook c1, queen e7, so I'll have to check it a little bit later, but this is where we're at. Now here Lazovic plays bishop b3. Around this point, while I was doing my live commentary on my Kick channel, I had a feeling that Magnus was going to win this game for the following reason. Even though this position is equal, we will end up in a situation where it's a knight versus bishop and middle game, end game, and the bishop really has no targets at all, whereas the knight can always be maneuvered to some better squares. So already here, I had a feeling that Magnus might win the game, even though the evaluation is objectively completely equal. We get rook d8, rook c8 is played. Lazovic goes g3, trying to bring the king to g2. We get g6, a3, king g7 played, and now we have king g2. Here Magnus goes b6, just putting the pawns on the opposite color of the light square bishop. Now we have queen to f3, we get rook to d8, Lazovic plays rook d3, and Magnus decides to swap the rooks and play queen c5. Now again, I love Magnus's approach here, understanding that in a rapid or a blitz game, this bishop cannot do anything. It's staring at this pawn on f7, and while position is equal, this knight can always be rerouted, and the bishop just doesn't have any targets whatsoever. So Lazovic goes bishop c4, Magnus plays a5, trying to take some space on the king-queen side, I should say, but also putting his pawns on the opposite color of the bishop. Lazovic goes king f3, we get queen c8, king g2, queen c6, king f3, h5 played here, and now Lazovic plays bishop b3. Here Magnus decides to play the move b5, and while I understand this move, I am a little bit surprised that Magnus did not go h4 here for the following reason. If white were to take the pawn on h4, black can now move the knight, swing the queen over, and get a bastion with the knight on f4, and white is probably close to, I want to say close to loss. Maybe computers will still save the game, but the situation is very, very dire. If white plays g4, for example, now black can start to reroute the horse to g5, and after bishop d5, queen c1, there are all these pressures. There's pressure on e4, pressure on h3, queen f4, queen b2, and the bishop, again, it looks really pretty, but it's not actually doing a whole lot other than guarding the pawn and creating a sort of fantasy threat towards the pawn on f7. Instead, Magnus goes b5, though. We get bishop d5, queen d7, king g2, and now king f8. Again, I do wonder why Magnus did not play this h4 move. King f8, we get b4, a move that's not great, but very understandable in human play, because what Lazovic is thinking here is he's got this light square bishop, and when you go b4, let's say black trades, in an endgame, this pawn is on the same color as the bishop. So for example, say we get something like this, just to illustrate the point, white can always go bishop c6 and target this pawn on b5. Whereas if we go back, let me just set up another example. Say you get this endgame, takes here, something like this, takes, and you get something like this. The bishop cannot target this pawn. It's on the opposite color of the bishop, and so the structure here is definitely favorable to black. So it's really understandable Lazovic wants to fix the pawn on b5 on the same color as his bishop. Magnus decides to play the move a4 here, trying to keep more pawns on the queen side. Now this could definitely backfire because Magnus has now put two pawns on the same color as his bishop on d5. Lazovic goes f4 here, Magnus trades. F4, not a great move, but I understand why Lazovic did this. He's slowly getting low on time, and he's trying to simplify the position so he doesn't get super low and have many options in the position. So we get takes, queen c7, now we have queen d2 played, and this move actually loses the game on the spot. Now it looks like a normal move, and Magnus misses the reason that this is so bad, but if black were to play queen d6 here, this is close to winning for the following reason. If white moves the queen up, you take the pawn on f4. If white goes queen e3, you take and win the pawn. So we've established the queen can't move forward because you take. Queen goes here, you take. If white were to play a quiet move like king h2, the point behind queen d6 is revealed, which is that now you can take the pawn due to this pin. So you're threatening to take. Queen can't go anywhere without losing one of these two pawns, the knight or the queen. And if white goes king f3 guarding the pawns here, black can play queen d7, attacking this pawn on h3, and now if you go back, you lose the pawn on e4, and if you try to save it with queen h2, now I simply trade and win the pawn in the center of the board. So queen d6 would have been winning, but Magnus instead plays king e7 relatively quickly, which to me is a sign that Magnus is definitely not super sharp in this situation. So we get e5 from Lazovic, takes, queen d7 played here, and now we have queen c5 being played. Now queen d7 is a very, very tricky move from Magnus because in a king and pawn endgame, you never know exactly what's going on. Now Lazovic here could use 35 seconds and try to calculate whether to trade queens or not, but if he's wrong in this in the trade here, he will lose the game. Now the reason I suspect Lazovic did not go for this is he figured Magnus always has an extra tempo by pushing this pawn, probably like king f3, king e6, king e4, and h4 here, and it's a zugzwang and you're losing the game. But after king to e3, if black plays king d5, king d3, for example, if black goes back, there's always king e4 to force a draw. And when black plays g5, now you can go king to e3 here. And after takes, king c4, you go king g5, king b3 here, takes. Let's just say king b4, e6, a3, e7, a2. White queens first, checks the king, wins the pawn, and it will be a drawn queen and pawn endgame. But again, this is about 10 to 15 moves down the road, and you have to calculate this, and with such limited time, Lazovic decides not to trade. He believes that Magnus is winning in that king and pawn endgame when in fact it's a draw. So we get the check. King to e6, king g3 played here by Lazovic. Magnus plays queen d3, king h4, and now Magnus uses nearly 50 seconds to play this move king f5, which is a huge mistake. If Magnus had played the move g5, he would have won the game. And the reason he would have won is that if white takes with the pawn, which is a natural instinct, there's this tricky move queen c4 checking the king. After takes, white king can't get back in time. Black makes a queen, and if white tries to go b5 after c3 b6, actually not c3, sorry, after b5, black takes the pawn on e5 here, and if b6, black is in time. This is what we call the classic square. The king gets back to b8 here. You have 1 2 3, and white has 1 2 3 with these squares. So the king and the pawns form the classic right triangle, and after here you're back in time, and the c pawn is quicker than the white king getting back. So after g5, if takes queen c4, this is just losing. Let's just say takes, for example, takes b4 here. Black is simply in time. I think actually here king e5 again might be working with the same box as well. b4 maybe computer says is apparently a draw. Don't ask me why, but apparently it is. But Magnus does not see this idea, because if he sees this, then white would have to take the pawn with the king, and after check here takes king here, there's queen f5 check, king h4 takes here, queen takes e5, queen c6, and king e7, and black simply has an extra pawn. The king is wide open here, and I do not think anybody in the world would save this position with the white pieces, Magnus Carlsen included. Instead, Magnus goes king f5, Lazovic sacks a pawn with e6, we get king takes check, king d7, and now the great move king g5, trying to run the king up the board, and meanwhile the computer says that Lazovic should not lose. Magnus takes the pawn, we get queen takes b5, king to e7, queen c5, king e8 is played here, and now Lazovic plays this move queen e5. Now if I were playing this position, I would just go b5, try to push the pawn up the board. One of the themes in queen and pawn endgames is that if players have pass pawns on opposite sides, you try to push your pass pawn up the board. That's all that matters. So instead we get check, queen to e6 played. Now we have queen b8, king e7, queen c7, king f8. We got this queen e5 move being played here by Lazovic. Understandable, because what Lazovic is worried about here is that the king is getting checkmated. After b5, king g7, black is threatening queen g4, which would be a clean checkmate. And if you go queen e5, there's f6 forking the king and the queen, and black will win the game in a couple of moves as well. So here the computer thinks that king h6 is the one way to save it, but this is also a very tough move to play, because after g5 you feel like your king is getting mated. If you take, there's queen g6 and queen g4 mate, but after king h5 here there's no checkmate, because after queen g6 and king g4 the king simply escapes. Instead, Lazovic plays queen e5, and now Magnus decides to trade the queens. Huge error. If Magnus had played the move f6 check, forking the king and the queen, white has to trade, and after h4 it's bye-bye birdie. The h pawn is too fast here. After b5, king 8, b6, king d8, b7, king c7, the king stops this one, and after takes, h3, f5, h2, f6, black queens and wins the game by 1 tempo. Instead, Magnus trades the queens on e5, and now he goes king e7, and here Lazovic inexplicably plays this move king f4. Now in this position, Lazovic does have a protected pass pawn on the queen side, but black has a 3-on-1 here. So if you do not go b5 b6, you simply lose the game. If Lazovic had played b5, the game would have been a draw, because after king to d8 here, king f6 h4, you take h3 e6, h2 e7, king c7, queen, and just simply even king takes g6 here. White has an extra pawn on the queen side and can never lose the game. But instead, Lazovic, I think, just blacks out here and goes king f4, and now after king e6, white is simply lost. Even f6 here would win, because after takes king g3, black can simply push these pawns up the board and win the game. So Lazovic goes king f4, king e6. Now he goes king e4. Magnus starts pushing the two connected pawns. We get king d4, h4, king e4, h3, king f3, and after king takes e5, Lazovic resigns the game. Black king is inside the box here to stop the b pawn from getting to the end of the board here. We of course have the right triangle, and black has 3 extra pawns on the king side. So a shocking end to a match that was very, very close, with Lazovic and Magnus Carlsen trading many blunders throughout the match. End of the day, Magnus, as usual, finds a way to win the match by a score of 2.5 to 1.5. He wins the winner's bracket, and tomorrow, I think tomorrow, maybe it's the day after, he will be facing the winner of the loser's bracket, which will be either, I believe, Alireza Firouzja or Denis Lazovic. Now for Magnus, he has big chances to win the whole event, because since he won the winner's bracket, they will play a best of 4 match. If Magnus loses the best of 4 match, there's still another best of 2. So whoever wins the loser's bracket is going to have to beat Magnus in 2 matches to overcome the odds. Now, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave did do that last year. He did beat Magnus in back-to-back matches, but the odds are definitely against Lazovic and Firouzja. But there is a reason we play the game of chess, and that is that the results are not known. Players play the game, and surprises do happen. So, on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the Champions Chess Tour Chessable Masters, which is being held on chess.com in the year 2024. If you have not already subscribed to my channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we will be back soon with some more great YouTube-only content. See you guys. Bye.